Sam Seder, Emma Vigland on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program Daniel Hunter, author, activist, co-founder of Choose Democracy, and welcome for the first time Erica Chenoweth, political scientist at Harvard, co-author of Why Civil Resistance Works, who is here in their own capacity, and obviously not speaking for Harvard or on behalf of that institution. Want to make that clear. Daniel, let's start with you because you were on this program. I guess it was eight months ago. I can't remember exactly.
Feels like years.
Yes. In Trump years, it feels like we've all aged by 20. But anticipating sort of like how bad the Trump administration could be along the sort of, I guess, the spectrum of democracy, authoritarianism, and whatnot. Give us an update as to where you think we are from that moment.
Well, I'll say a couple of things, and I know Erica can add a few pieces here as context. But first, it's great to be on your show. Thank you. It's bad. I think we can level there pretty quickly, but I think the nature of it is interesting. So there's some pieces to track. So one is, in terms of following the authoritarian playbook, Trump didn't write it. This is not new. Other authoritarians around the globe have sort of written these playbooks about how these things work. He's been following it very closely, hewing very closely, making critics out of anybody who's sort of speaking against you, and then being retaliatory against them. Doing a lot of things that you do. You investigate your critics, you give license to lawbreaking, you do regulatory retaliation, you deploy the military domestically, federal law enforcement overreach. All of these things that we've seen are in the playbook. Some things that are uncharacteristic or less characteristic, the speed is very fast. And that's by design. The speed has been very fast in order to keep people off kilter. And I think the other piece to track, just in terms of like where we are at the moment, has been the resistance has also been very different than we've often done the U.S. And we'll talk a little bit more of that. But just that he's following the playbook. He's following the authoritarian playbook. They're in operation. They're moving quickly on it. And what we're seeing right now is someone who's moving very quickly to try to sort of consolidate their power.
Erica, when we say that he's following the playbook, is it that the playbook is so instinctual for people who aspire to this type of power, or is Russell Vogt and some of the other heritage people, do they have a conference where they get together and go like, this is the playbook, and so let's follow it? Like, how does that happen? I mean, like being spiteful and firing the head of the BLS, if you're Stephen Miller, getting the Republicans to, juice the ICE and to have the military come in, these seem to be like, they're just, childhood aspirations versus like following a playbook. But what is it, or does it even matter?
I think there's been substantial learning between the first and second Trump administrations. If you think about where the country was at this point during Trump season one, there was a lot more, shall we say, bureaucratic or institutional resistance to what he was trying to implement. There'd been substantial judicial pushback, and there was, his administration abided by court rulings uniformly, including when it was inconvenient. They would, for things like the Muslim ban when it first came out, they actually withdrew it after all the protests because they recognized they didn't have a legal case for it. And they revised it and put it in again. It was struck down. They revised it a third time, and eventually a much more narrow version of it held in the courts. But they were responsive both to grassroots resistance and mobilization, to judicial resistance to what they were doing constitutionally, and to resistance within the GOP. So where we are now is that between Trump 1 and Trump 2, is that those different points of resistance have either been weakened substantially or eliminated in the early days of Trump season 2, which is to say, the first step was basically to try to purge all the bureaucratic resistance points, right? And that was like, the opening salvo was to try to break down any resistance within the executive branch. Then there's longstanding efforts to break down resistance within the GOP, kind of between Trump 1 and 2, and now it's his party. And then the third piece is basically not caring whether what is being done is legal, awaiting a challenge, pushing the law to its limits, and forcing the judiciary to be at war with itself. Right. So if you look at some recent analyses by Adam Bonica, who's a political scientist at Stanford, he found that something like 94% of the lower court decisions were going against Trump's moves, and 94% of SCOTUS is going for them. And so that is, by definition, a judiciary that is at war with itself and therefore cannot contain any of the sort of executive excesses that we're seeing play out. And like Daniel said, Trump is using time to his advantage by, the sort of muzzle velocity approach. But with the courts, these things can't be resolved for years, right? So the Overton window can sort of move even while the legal arguments are being sorted out, and even if some of this stuff is ultimately struck down. So has he learned from other authoritarians? Maybe. I think some of the Project 2025 people imported some ideas from Hungary and other recent cases of backsliding. But I think mostly he learned from his first term and is trying to eliminate those sources of resistance as they stand in the United States.
So what has been what let's talk about sort of like what has been different, Daniel, from that time where, the last time you were on, you walked us through or explained to us the sort of gaming out that you were involved with military, former military personnel, a wide range of people, a lot of whom you found yourself somewhat surprised to be sitting next to in a less than confrontational way. What is there? Has there been anything that the Trump administration has done outside of the speed, which of course, like you say, Project 2025, they hit the ground running in a way that they could not have, even if they had done 2 successive terms. I think like they were they benefited extremely from that break, essentially. But aside from the speed, have they done anything that has been different than you had anticipated? But it all seems to have gone and maybe grade their various things, because it feels like across the board, they've gotten their wish list.
Well, a couple of things. So I think one, yes, the speed has been. I think another thing that's been different than I anticipated, at least, has been the degree to which it's warfare in every direction. So as opposed to focusing on 2 or 3 institutions, that's really there's been a clarion call, which is we're doing all warfare all the time with everybody. There is a downside to that, which they're beginning to experience, which is when you do warfare all the time with everybody, you begin fracturing up your internal base. And so it's not possible to take on everybody. And MAGA isn't one coherent whole. It is a series of different bodies that are cobbled together. And that's true for any kind of regime like this. And so one of the things that's been surprising to me, and I think we haven't really remarked on how surprising this is, how volatile that team is and how splittable it's been. So Elon Musk is the classic example of this at the moment, which is Elon Musk and him had gotten in bed together. They'd made a pact. They were always going to be somewhat unstable as 2, rich guys who are ego driven. But the Tesla takedown movement, everybody who's involved in, not buying Teslas, telling people not to, showing up in protests, that entire that entity of a movement played its role in cleaving off a whole section of the MAGA energy, and specifically Elon Musk, but also a lot of the people that came with it. And so I think another piece of it, and I'm not trying to be positive just for the sake of being positive, but that it is expose vulnerabilities, even in the midst of, as you said, I think quite accurately, even in the midst of achieving a huge amount of victories very quickly. And so I think both of those things being true next to each other has been interesting to unfold. The other piece that I didn't anticipate, and people who've been studying authoritarians have told me that this is actually fairly common, is the incompetence level. So I think just remembering Signalgate and this was the moment, right, where wars were being organized through signal chats. So it appears the amount of incompetence in the administration is consistent with regimes who have needed to hire for loyalty above competence.
Right.
And when you do that, you have a level of ignorance about how the systems work that's very strong.
Your applicant pool is just smaller.
It's a smaller pool. And that a result of that is this administration needs everyone to constantly believe it's being very successful. So in areas where they haven't been able to be successful at moving things forward, they change the discourse right away rather than focusing on or having us focus on areas where they haven't been as successful, where they haven't been able to move things forward the way they wanted to. And so it's true that they've been able to move fast, break a lot of things. Their interest in sort of surviving entities, that's not what they're trying to do. They're willing to just break a lot of things to get their way. But they're also moving in a way that is, again, led by such a level of incompetence that they've also been very unsuccessful at achieving a lot of the things that they want to achieve as well.
Well, Erica, then I guess then my next question is then what does this do for setting up the future of like the government that this new one big beautiful bill is supposed to create, which is this explosion of the ICE budget, which is the thing that I think a lot of folks here are so concerned about. Because if we're seeing this authoritarian playbook play out and they're moving with such speed, they haven't even gotten all the tools that they need to implement their agenda, or that they're going to get, or not need, but that they're going to get. That we're about to see this mass hiring effort for ICE agents. They're offering these major bonuses. And is there anything in the history that shows that once you kind of create these cracks, that this gives, I don't know, rise and greater ease to these Gestapo tactics that we're seeing? Is that what you anticipate?
Yeah, I think Daniel's right that that incompetence comes along with hiring for loyalty. It's malign incompetence, though, and one of the areas in which we see that is through the explosion of the immigration enforcement as sort of the primary arm of government repression, is what I would call it. And so, having a mass recruitment drive does mean that it will draw in kind of three different groups of people who are interested in participating. One is folks who are looking for a pay raise and who are maybe already in an adjacent industry and have already kind of gone through all the hoops of deciding whether that's the way they want to spend their working career or not. And so it's pretty low barrier to entry for folks who are just looking for a pay raise. The second group is people who are actually true believers, like they're animated by this call. They view it as a sacred duty to defend the country because they believe what Trump has said about immigrants, and so are gonna sign up for that reason. And then there's sort of a third group of people who are more like profiteers. So this is one step up from opportunists and people who are actually quite cynical in the way that they will personally benefit from or enrich themselves. And these would be the people who are sort of the people building these temporary camps at huge costs that line their pockets, et cetera. And so, I think it's useful to think about that people are coming in with different motivations and therefore have different levels of, shall we say, tolerance for what they're going to be asked to do or forced to do. And that provides lots of opportunities for fissures and for thinking through how, like, non-cooperation with immigration enforcement might play out in the country. So I think there's in the past, it is often the case that movements that win because they're able to sow levels of either discontentment, even with just like the lack of professionalism or other things that people, they join because they are seeking, these different things. And if they feel like they don't get them, they're not going to stay. We've already seen some people who were hired rapidly to help guard the camp in the Everglades, and they've left already. And they've even come to news journalists and described like how terrible the conditions were and how it wasn't worth it. Like the mosquitoes are so bad, we get one spray a day or something like that. And like it was too hot and it wasn't near what I expected. And so I left after 2 weeks or something. So, we're going to see more of that play out. And it's significant. Like those things are, what's important is, as Daniel said, like there will be attempts to cover it up. There'll be attempts to tell a different story about this sort of righteous cause. And so it's important for people to shine the light on the facts.
That's interesting. It hadn't occurred to me, but almost the more money they offer, the more opportunity there is for people to come in and be disillusioned because, like $50,000 bonus, maybe what I'm reading about ICE is not true, or I don't follow it on Instagram. And then I get there and it's like, whoa, this is a crap show. Well, I'm curious also.
And then you won't get your bonus, Sam, because you won't stay for 5 years.
Well,
right.
I mean, I may end up being, those will probably be the people who are going to be leaking information to the press, right? I mean, that's like the perfect, it seems to me, description of somebody who's there, disgruntled. They put, they're banking on this. Maybe they left another job. As the economy gets worse, I would imagine there's going to be more of those people, but I also would imagine they're going to start to it's steal a pencil type of thing, right? Where you make yourself feel better at work, I guess. But Erica, I'm curious, is there anything that surprises you about this? The incompetence, I have to tell you, doesn't surprise me because I saw that at Air America when we were working for a con man. Everybody, it was all loyalty. And so people who are completely incompetent were moving up the ranks because their number one job was to protect the guy at the top. And that was the only thing that they were measured against. Was there anything else that has struck you about what has happened that was unsurprising as of, let's say, January?
Yeah, in January and February, I was surprised at how little resistance there was from kind of prominent civil society institutions. So again, during Trump 1, we saw kind of the corporate sphere and big business and whatever kind of saying, this is excessive, and we want to keep a stable economy. We don't want to break things or whatever. And this time there seemed to be much less. In fact, the entirety of the tech sector, like waltzing in and sitting in the front row in front of even all of the cabinet members, was like such a visual demonstration of what to expect. The other thing that surprised me, though, and I think it's important to mention, is that there was all this discourse about how little resistance was happening, but it seemed like people were conflating resistance from kind of important civic institutions with grassroots resistance. And in fact, there's been a huge amount of that, much more than what the sort of common discourse suggests. And so my team at the Crowd Counting Consortium has been documenting protests every single day since the Women's March of 2017. So we have a good sense over time about the trajectory here. And by the end of May of 2025, we'd observed more than 3 times as many protests in the US as had happened by May of 2017. So in other words,
fascinating, because you would not know that from the news.
Right.
That's right. Yeah. And some days in which we've seen like some of the largest single days of protest in US history, not any of the largest single day protests in US history, as far as I know, but among the largest, right? And we've had multiple of those already, in the first 6 months. So I think this is significant because it surely demonstrates a huge appetite for for a way to organize a collective response that is humane and small d democratic to what's going on, and a population that has more skills also and had learned from the first administration also. And, Daniel and Choose Democracy were a part of this running into the 2020 election. But, there have been, these massive trainings like the 1 million Rising training that Daniel and several of his colleagues have been involved in over the last couple of weeks, where there's just been like tens of thousands of people, right, who are signing on to these trainings to understand how they can better use peaceful resistance and nonviolent resistance to interrupt the consolidation of authoritarianism in the United States. And so I'm not exactly surprised, but what surprises me is how little people are talking about that and the sort of historic moment in which we are now situated.
Along those lines, in terms of the institutions, I think we're both a little bit, both Emma and I are both a little, what would it be? Lawyer centric, because of our relative upbringings. I was really shocked. I mean, we've seen it in the educational sphere. Some schools have been much more reluctant, heavy hitters, but like Columbia collapsed like a house of cards. And law firms, some of the bigger law firms in New York City collapsed very quickly. There was one or two others that then and that feels like it's turned a little bit, although those deals still happen with those lawyers. What are the implications of that? Both in terms of like the educational institutions, but also the legal one has both like sort of the optics quality, like it sends a signal to everybody, but it also has a real sort of material quality. All of a sudden this administration full of incompetence has like some of the best lawyers in the country to, I guess, deport people. What are the implications of that particular institution having capitulated to the extent that it did?
Yeah.
So let me walk that through. So for folks who weren't tracking all these different law firms, initially there was like a number of different law firms who, as you said, began negotiating with Trump to basically say, in a way to avoid a whole host of sort of retribution that Trump was listing, they said, we'll make a deal with you. And so they would agree to what I think Paul Weiss agreed to, $40 million worth of pro bono services, and also to end their DEI programs internally and maybe a couple of other things. And as far as we know, this isn't necessarily written down. The question is still very live in the law community and the legal community of what do these pro bonos, what's offered. It's not a open book where Trump can just call them up and make them do whatever, but it says where we both agree these are shared values. So I think the specifics aren't entirely known, but I also think we learn a little bit about the nature of resistance in this period of time, which is a number of law firms fairly quickly folded, and painfully so. And so Paul Weiss, which is one of those who folded, there's a woman named Rachel Cohen who very publicly quit. Yeah. And so she was very clear and very articulate about why this shouldn't happen, what was wrong about this, and did the organizing job that someone does, which is he organized 300 people to sign within the legal community saying, we're not going to stand for this. And so she became actually a demarking moment in which afterwards it became much more challenging for other law firms. And in fact, there were very few law firms who capitulated after that point. And so essentially what we saw was the organizing within a community to then say, actually, we're going to have a backbone. They hadn't had to practice with this. They were responding to what looked like quick, maybe end of their entire careers, et cetera, moves by Trump. And they developed their backbone. That principle, her act of she quit in a blaze of condemnation. Her act was a staunch. It was a way to heal the sort of wounds that had happened in terms of preventing the domino effect of capitulation. And that practice of non-cooperation, of not complying, we're seeing in lots of fields now where other people who are participating. And so we could just walk around. So you talked about education. So Sarah Anama, who is a woman who was told that she had to take down a poster that said, what was it? That everyone is welcome. That she had to take down a poster that said everyone is welcome because of the new DEI principles. Yeah. And so she's in Idaho, and she said, no, I'm not going to do it. She refused to comply. And so in response, she again organized her community. And so community members began wearing T-shirts that says everyone is welcome. They distributed 20,000 on one day. They then began, students chalked everyone is welcome outside the school. And so they were reasserting their value. And so we're out of practice. This country has not had to defend these kinds of values in this kind of way in some time. And so there are sets of the communities who have not been involved in any kind of protest or organizing or action. And they're not necessarily going to go into the streets, as Erica pointed out, but they are going to be involved in other kinds of non-compliance and non-cooperation. And that's what we're seeing. And so the time piece, the reason that they have to keep us moving very quickly as the Trump administration is because they want us to be in constant response mode. So we're not in a way that we can talk to our neighbors, to our colleagues, to our friends about how do we resist this thing. Because when we get a little bit of space and time, there is in this country enough value held that we can say, no, everyone is welcome. And we can say, no, we're not going to accept these. Go ahead, Emma.
This is it's an important example, right? But here's my cynical take on it is like, she was a Harvard graduate at Skadden, and that story broke through in part because I think that you had a lot of law firms that it's not in there. They didn't want to capitulate in many ways. And there's a lot of wealthy people that work at those firms. And so that story maybe got elevated by the press or the mainstream media in the way that, say, these mass protests aren't. Or, I will have cable news on in the background. Donald Trump's approval rating is, I think, the second lowest that it's been recorded in terms of the average. But you would not know it if you're listening to the main news shows at night. It's not necessarily this major focus. So what is the challenge, I guess, Erica, I'll ask this of you, when there isn't some level of money behind it, it feels like right now our corporate media institutions are still shying away from the most poignant critiques of the administration, or just the facts that would show how unpopular and how that would create conditions for mass mobilization if there was more understanding of how vulnerable they could be with this lack of popularity. There's still this chilling effect that I think I'm a little bit more skeptical that it's going to break here right now.
I think you're onto something, Emma, but I'd also say, this is another part of the authoritarian playbook, which is to say, dominate the information ecosystem. So we've seen similar behaviors by the administration toward the media, as we saw, toward law and these other sectors that you talked about, which is, very early on, the AP was going to be banned for, refusing to call it the Gulf of America, from the White House press pool. This would be an opportunity for collective action, right, by the other members of the right correspondent, and we didn't see it, no. Right, and so I think that's the issue is that there's been so little collective action at points when it was really meaningful that it sort of invites more bullying and more extortionary methods. And so what we can expect to see when there isn't effective collective action is an escalation by the administration against the whole sector, and one by one, as well as everyone at once. And so I just think that this is just something to know. I mean, I sort of, in my mind, I kind of think about, is there a pithy way to describe the mental framework or the mental model that could be useful for people when they are in the midst of this type of territory? And I think, maybe one of them is, when something like that happens, think autocracy. That's a good descriptor of it. It's one of the behaviors that defines an autocratic government. But act democracy, which is to say, don't act in a way that would suggest we still live in a country in which you can expect and demand the rule of law to apply. And the reason is that if people just cave and they allow the extortion, they allow the bullying to result in concessions and accommodations and other things, that's not democracy. That's not how it works. And so people need to still work democracy and push back in that way. Otherwise, it's sort of like your First Amendment rights. Like if you don't defend them, you lose them.
So, on some level, like the autocracy is, it's got that shark thing where it has to keep moving, has to keep consuming people's rights. It doesn't have the ability to say like, okay, we're good here. It has to constantly. So capitulating is only just going to open the door to more of this. I just want to note too, what I also found fascinating on the law firm thing was that clients started abandoning Paul Weiss, which I thought was huge. So like, let's talk about the sort of the knock-on effects, like within like these silos, right? Like at one point, I think the idea is that like we need to cross these sort of sectors and there needs to be some solidarity across sectors. But first, everybody's got to sort of like establish some leadership within the different sectors so that there's an opportunity, theoretically, I guess, to sort of like, bring these things together. But talk about the dynamic, Erica and Daniel, I'd like both of your opinions on this, of like sort of the knock-on effect. Like I'm not a huge South Park fan. I remember their perspective on the Iraq War. I'm that old, but I felt like, but I will say that my 12-year-old really enjoyed seeing Donald Trump's talking penis, and also the idea of like them saying "F you" to Paramount, them saying "F you" to everybody there who, and we don't know what kind of risk there is associated with them. I mean, maybe they could lose their $1.5 billion contract. Maybe it was never that, who knows? Mm-hmm. What is the sort of the sociology behind that? Like the knock-on effect of just watching somebody do that?
Well, I'll just take the psychology aspect of it, which is there are two different stories constantly in competition right now. One story is the story that Trump wants to tell, which is, I am dominating. And so that's one story. A second story is the story of people who are being courageous and saying, we are organizing and able to push back. Those things are going to be in competition to each other, right? And so one aspect of just the psychology piece is every time people are courageous and are able to get their voices out there. And Emma, your point that like, Rachel being well known for a number of reasons is great, but there are many thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people who are now taking risks with their careers and how they're operating in the street. There are lots of people taking risks. And one way that we can very quickly hurt our own cause is to push down those stories and say, that's not enough. The alternative is for us to encourage and to uplift those stories as acts of courage, that we want more of that kind of behavior. So that's an easy thing that we can do without a huge amount of risk, even of ourselves, but is our choice of which stories we are telling. And so that continues to be why I tell like just another story is Elizabeth Costello, who is a mother of 5, lives in Pasadena, just outside of LA. She saw 6 people who were being seized by ICE at a donut shop, and she said, absolutely not. And so she just began pulling out a megaphone and walking outside her neighborhood, just telling people when ICE was coming. And that became part of what became a structure within her apartment and neighborhood of alerting people to when ICE was coming in. These are acts of courage that individuals are setting up. And our choice about how we tell those stories, how we uplift those stories, is very important for making it possible for us to shift the authoritarian system that we're underneath.
Because it emboldens other people
within
brings their whatever context they're in.
Yeah. So we have to actively work on protecting our own courage, because again, the way we can assist Trump, if we want to assist him, is by dismissing those stories. Those are very important for us to hold on to as parts of acts of courage. Take the next piece of that, Erica.
Yeah, I would just say, when we think about really important moments in social movement history of the United States, and campaigns that were waged that ultimately, changed systems even. A lot of them didn't start out with some kind of well-formulated strategic plan that was going to apply nationally or whatever. It was through people experimenting locally where they lived with different techniques of non-cooperation. And then the ones that worked started to be replicated elsewhere. And so when you said like kind of knock-on effects, Sam, what I was thinking about was the sort of demonstration effects of a powerful intervention by a community that then is picked up and used elsewhere to even more powerful effect. And the Woolworths, lunch counter sit-ins that started in February of 1960, where 4 Black students went in and sat down in a place that explicitly did not serve Black students in North Carolina at a lunch counter and refused to leave till it closed, even though they were threatened with arrest, resulted in, within 4 days, 300 people coming and joining them at that lunch counter. And many of them were ultimately arrested for disorderly conduct and other kind of manufactured crimes. And then within 2 months, lunch counter sit-ins were happening in, over 50 cities and towns and 13 states, including in Nashville, Tennessee, where that actually escalated into a desegregation of the entire city. Not just lunch counters, but department stores and every other place of commerce. And that's an example of just people getting together and experimenting and something working, and then it working in many other places and becoming almost like a foundational memory of what the civil rights movement was able to achieve. And it even helped create SNCC, that the student activists who were part of it then created this infrastructure that was able to then organize many other effective campaigns and build a whole generation of activists who, later serve in Congress and just be leading lights in the country's history. So I just want to say, there are these double knock-on effects. The one is the fear that is brought by a sense that everyone is capitulating and no one is holding the line. But there's also the demonstration effects of people doing the thing and experimenting and not expecting them to have all the answers, but to recognize courage where it comes and to replicate the successes when they happen.
As you bring that up, and I also just wanted to ask, and I assume the Texas thing, them leaving the state to fight the redistricting is just whether it ultimately works from a material standpoint, it is just a show of people being defiant in pursuit of a good goal is just a good sort of message for people to have. But is there, I'm not sure about this, but I know that certainly during the first Trump years, I was, I don't know, I had a mild allergy to the idea of democracy being threatened. Then certainly there were moments where I was I don't know if we're at I specifically remember saying this on some TV show, I don't know if we're, headed to fascism, but I do know that if we were headed to fascism, this is one of the stops along the way. Now, the idea that, people go travel, they feel like they got to scrub their phones to come back in, that there are companies afraid to do things, that people are afraid to censoring themselves. We're here, right? This is nascent authoritarianism. Is there a challenge that's different from segregation was explicit? Some people I'm for it, some people I'm against it. Can either one of you, I guess, address the quality of it's sort of hard to sense authoritarianism isn't so binary that it's because it's sliding into simmering into boiling water. There's a quality to that as opposed to the existence of segregation. And, people had different, obviously, opinions on that, but, and people may have different opinions about authoritarianism. I think, we've seen from Curtis Yarvin, et cetera, but the presence of it, like are there mechanisms to make that the existence of it more clear so that the idea of resistance becomes more urgent?
So, this is a real trap for people in these types of times, because exactly as you say, there are no bright lines from which a country, sort of crosses from democracy into autocracy. What happens is there's a deconsolidation of democratic institutions that happens somewhat unevenly and in parallel. And so it's often not obvious that you're in like a fully consolidated autocracy until after it's basically obvious, right? And so, but in previous episodes of backsliding,
and almost too late.
Yeah, well, there's significantly less space and opportunity for effective resistance, for sure. And so in similar episodes, I guess the social science research would say there's a bit of a consensus that once a slide of the kind that we're in begins, there's something like 18 months to 2 years max before it's consolidated. That's like an average over the last 80 years or so of data, I think. And so it's not necessarily predictive, but if the US followed that trajectory, like that's what people could expect, is that it's this slow, it's a fast decline, but day by day, people aren't recognizing at any point at which they're like, aha, this is the moment in which, and people were saying at the beginning of the administration, if he defies a court order, that would be the red line for me. Well, where are we now?
Chuck Schumer was saying that. Right. Chuck Schumer, the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, was saying that.
Constitutional crisis, it comes and goes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you trust the Washington Post reporting last week, they say that something like 30% of the lower court orders have been ignored or evaded at this point. And
we just confirmed Emil Bovee, who 3 different whistleblowers said his policy was to F the courts.
Right. So we are in the trap that people fall into is they think that if it's legal, it must be democratic. What Greg Abbott is doing right now and threatening that he'll put in charge with felonies all of the Democrats who are out of state right now if they don't come back and form a quorum so that they can pass this fundamentally anti-democratic law, is he is actually just using the maximal powers of his office and legal authorities that he says he has and that he may indeed have if the courts decide he has them, right? And so this is it, is that autocrats will jawbone. They will basically, file suit or depend on suit, but they'll do what they want in the short term and worry about the legality of it later. And it may, in fact, be that the courts decide what they did is technically illegal, but under no reasonable terms could you call it democratic in terms of its norms, right? So it's sort of like democracy depends on people in positions of power actually not exercising the full extremity of their authorities every day of the week, right? It requires them to restrain themselves most of the time. Because actually the Constitution allows executives to do a lot of things under emergencies. And if they manufacture those emergencies, the courts seem to defer, right? That's what the Supreme Court is doing, is it's deferring to Trump about when something is an emergency or not. And, and he gets to decide because he's the president, right? So I think this is like a very, the thing that people need to understand, I think, about democracies, it's only as good as the leader's commitment to it who we elect. And so if people want a democracy, they have to elect people who believe in democracy and who will fight for it and who are and who can express it in a way that is actually not partisan in a way. And that is one of the fundamental differences that we've got between the cast of characters we're dealing with in Trump 1 versus 2, is that there were still people in the GOP in Trump 1 who you could classify as small d Democrats.
Well, okay. So there's 2 problems as I see it, Daniel, with this. Is that one, I think Ben Rhodes even wrote something like this shortly after the election. Like, when Harris was going around selling democracy, people were hearing like, "Oh, that system that is screwing me over," and that's a problem. I mean, it may be a category error, or maybe there's a couple of That's an entire another topic on some level. But and B, how do you articulate this or show this? Like, what actions can people like our listeners take that provide an example? And for those people who have fallen into that trap of like, well, it's legal, or, I mean, Paul Weiss is like, well, they're fighting anti-Semitism. Of course not. But able to justify to themselves that this is going to be better than that. Like, what can people who watch this, listen to this, what can they do in their daily lives, or maybe a slightly transcendent daily life, to illustrate and manifest the changes that have taken place, that maybe they don't follow the news that much. They don't, how can people sort of effectively show what's going on to other people?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing, and I'll just plug your show, which is one thing you do in your show is you help people not just take the individual awful things that happen, but we have to help people put it together with some language, so that we're not just dealing with one bad thing, one bad thing, one bad thing that's coming out of the Trump administration, but it's an autocratic takeover. So just in the way that we talk about it, this is not a normal government. This is a regime, and needs to be understood in that way, in the way that you talk about the Hitler regime, and the way you talk about other regimes who have not operated based on normal ways of operating. So I think just everything Erica said about sort of understanding the totality of where we are and the language for it, and we're experimenting with the language. I mean, I think we just got to be clear, like, none of us have the answers here. We're in some new, fresh territory. And so that is part of the challenge. What's the language? How do we talk about it, et cetera? I think a second thing that needs to happen that's important is any acts that signal publicly people's opposition to any aspect of this. So, for example, one of the things that we've been doing, Erica alluded to a training, we did a 1 Million Rising training where we trained about 170,000 people in sort of non-cooperation techniques and tactics. And so one of the things, for example, we've been talking about has been a very intro action of just having people put up signs in your homes or in businesses saying no ICE, no kings. And the logic here is there are actually a lot more people who are opposed to the general thing that's happening, whatever we call it, anti-authoritarianism. They don't like Trump thinking of himself as the king. They don't believe in the way that he's operating or the incompetence level, any number of the different pieces that he's got. And we need to signal that opposition in a broader way. And do we have the language that we're all sharing? Do we have the words? No, we don't. We don't have a functional opposition party, right? The Democratic Party is not a functional opposition party. They are not giving us that language. And honestly, I want them to, on the one hand, and on the other hand, I think there's a real opportunity that they're not. Because if they did it in the shape that they're in right now, it would be, I think it would be a version of exactly what got us here, which is trying to bring us back to a Biden era that will never happen again. We are past that point. It's broken. It's gone. Let's move on.
We saw their resistance first time around, and we're back.
Exactly.
Here. Yeah.
Exactly. So we need a new thing, a new playbook. Where that comes from, I'm not clear myself. But I think we should be appreciative that the Democratic Party isn't there as our leaders right now, because we're going to need some wiser voices that aren't in that circle.
So they're not sort of absorbing the energy as it was.
No, clearly not. I mean, they're not in the forefront of any of this.
I'm trying to find my Chuck Schumer glasses here.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
So, what that means is we're in a little bit of a void, and that is uncomfortable. But that means it's also a chance for us to ask ourselves, what do we want? And so I say, one, I mean, you asked me what are some practical things. So one, talk about authoritarianism, bring your friends, your family, your people into the broad spectrum. It's not just one thing, it's a series. Two, show visual acts of resistance. We call it kind of a social pressure campaign. That is, that one that allows people to see that other people are in any kinds of defiance. So that, again, it could be any issue around trans rights, it could be around LGBTQ issues, it could be around the way he's been just targeting any number immigrants, any number of things. Showing that publicly. The third thing is getting ourselves in alignment with not complying, getting our institutions ready for collective action when it comes to us. Some of us have already had that. Some of us is going to come to us. Everybody years out, everyone's going to have an opportunity to not comply. Everyone's going to have a chance to be asked to do something that's immoral, corrupt, wrong, and make a personal call. But it's going to be best if you are connected to some other people. So people typically don't make that kind of resistance, that act of non-compliance, just because I'm alone doing it. They do it because they're connected with some other people, some friends, family, coworkers, who've already had some conversations about how do we want to defy? How do we want to not cooperate? And so, I mean, on choosedemocracy.us, we put up just like, what are some different things that people can do? Very practically, just sort of different behaviors depending on what, institution you're with. But the basic act here is get yourself ready.
Erica, I know you've written about 3.5% rule. Will you tell us about that?
Sure. Yeah. So the 3.5% rule refers to just the historical observation that between the periods of 1900 and 2006, movements that were challenging their governments to oust dictatorships or create territorial independence out of colonial situations tended not to fail if they mobilized 3.5% of their population in a peak event. And I say it's a historical observation, which is important because it's, I would say, a descriptive statistic, but not a prescriptive or predictive one, which is to say, nobody can predict the future, and so it's useful as kind of a tendency to keep in mind about the level of mobilization that historically has been a critical threshold for movements against autocracy, and it's also just a descriptive statistic. So we don't know what's behind that number. For example, how many years the mobilization was taking place prior, which types of organizing strategies went into building a movement of that mass, whether there were other things happening, like whether the movement was able to elicit those defections from police or security forces in ways that really destabilized their opponents, where the business and economic kind of pillar was situating itself in that conflict. And so it's not a magic number in the sense that just mobilizing that many people one time does not create some kind of guarantee that a movement would automatically win or something. But I think then that threshold speaks to broader capacity, strategy, and leadership that could get a country to a place where such a substantial number of people were engaged. And I know that it sounds like a small number, but it's not. It's a very large number in absolute terms, especially in large countries like the United States. If it were applied here, it would be around 12 million people. And to my knowledge, we haven't seen a movement in the sort of contemporary era reach that threshold. So it would be a historical threshold and would probably, if it happened, be the result of a lot of capable, sustained strategy, organizing, discipline, leadership, all of the things that has gone into making successful movements in the past. The last thing I'll say is that most mass movements that have succeeded in creating a democratic transition out of an autocratic government succeeded without mobilizing 3.5% of the population. So a smaller proportion of the populace. Quite rare to have cases that reach that threshold. So this is just to say, I think the figure can be useful in sometimes giving people a sense of hope about what we can learn from past cases.
Right. You don't need
also
75% of the people.
Exactly,
you don't need 51% of the people to affect change.
That's right. And I think what happens is that people then can identify their own agency in that number, right? They can see how, oh, like we're just talking about me organizing in my community and being part of something big enough to have an impact without, having to convince, like you say, 75% of the population or something like that.
I think people are surprised by the how low that is. I mean, for years and years, people have been saying, you just preach into the choir. And I'm like, yeah, but the choir actually, if the choir is big enough, relative to the congregation, they're the ones who are going to do all the change. They're the ones who go to the bake sales and do the car washes. I mean,
and what is so striking to me, and I think important for people to take away from your work here, is that capitulation just gives them more oxygen on every issue. And it doesn't matter how that issue polls, as we're seeing with immigration. Trump, that was his best polling issue. And after the LA National Guard thing, it's in the toilet. I mean, he's basically really underwater on every one of his key issues. And we could have maybe had a stronger opposition had so many Democrats not signed on to something like the Lake and Riley Act early on, and giving him these tools. Like, I just wonder if your lessons had been internalized, and we know the Democrats are incapable, but just going forward, we could have maybe mounted a much stronger resistance had we not given them all this opportunity.
The biggest moment to impact the sort of political opportunities that we have is generally around elections. And so if we sort of reverse back and think about the 2024 election, I think you can see how, a small minority of the population and how they show up or whether they show up is absolutely decisive, right? So our elections are so close or have been so close that it is a very small minority within the population that determines the outcome. If you looked at the sort of breakdown and the way the election played out, the largest block of voters or eligible voters were the people who didn't come out to vote, followed by Trump winning by a relatively small margin over Harris. And so that's a place where you can definitely see, if there had been even a small proportion of the population, a modest one, 2% of the population behaving in a different way, we would have seen a different outcome. And so, it is about kind of, wanting to build majorities for sure, but also the way that our electorate behaves, it requires a relatively modest number of people in the country to shift in order to build those majorities.
And just lastly, Daniel, on the other side of something like this, in the event that things go well, people resist, then maybe there is the winning the House becomes some type of toehold, perhaps to police what Trump is doing to some extent. Obviously, we're going to need people, citizens to, stop this at the end of the day. But what generally follows something like this? Are we going to get Biden 2.0? Is that going to be the outcome of this? Or is there generally, if the effort exerted to stop something like the authoritarianism we're seeing now and expect to grow, how far does that punch through the board as it was? Like what happens on the other side of this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can talk about what has happened historically. So Erica referenced a body of work where they've looked at sort of case of democratic backsliding. That's the euphemism that they use in academic terminology. But when shit hits the fan like this, how often were people successful at doing it? And the piece you just mentioned is really critical, which is with no civil resistance movement, the democracies do in fact backslide the vast majority of times. So if there's no civil resistance movement, if we don't get in the streets, if we don't do the things, if we don't, all the different behaviors that contribute, 7.5% of the time they lose. They win. Only 7.5% of the time are they able to win. With a civil resistance movement, they can win over half, 51.7. So the civil resistance movement is critical. Why is it critical? It's critical because it's unhappy about how things are, and typically it's often unhappy about how things have been. And so it's not just that the movement is asking for a return to, but typically in those cases where people have been able to undo their backsliding, the democracies advance in terms of they become more inclusive, more, name some of those values that people are going for. They become more democratic than they were before. If they don't, they get punished for it because they then return through the authoritarian cycle again, traditionally. And so this is our moment. If you are unhappy with where we are, and I am very unhappy with where we are, I'm very unhappy with where we've been. Biden era was I was not with it. And this is the moment in which, yes, what you're saying, Sam, is very doable, not easy to do, but very doable, which is movements who've been able to mount a resistance, kick out the authoritarian regime, not just Trump, but the regime itself. They're then able to assert higher values for higher democracies, higher protections, greater access than we've experienced before anywhere in my lifetime. So that's the hope. That's what we're aiming for. And experience from other countries shows that is doable. That is a pathway available to us in this time.
Daniel Hunter, Erica Chenoweth, what are there websites that we should point people to for more information that may help them in terms of organizing, or to just get plugged into either the work that either one of you are doing, et cetera? Where should we point people?
People go to choosedemocracy.us. On that, we keep a kind of running actions of what are some different things people can do if they're just looking to get plugged in, either organizations that are already involved or so forth. And then we're part of a crew called Freedom Trainers, freedomtrainers.net. We've been training people in non-cooperation. I think we've trained over 250,000 people in techniques of non-cooperation, from people who are inside institutions or inside federal bureaucracy to people who are regular folk who are just trying to figure out, what do I do in this moment in time?
And lastly, let me just, there's one more thing. You're training people to fight the authoritarianism. The answers that they have, these aren't necessarily exclusive of those more democratic answers, right? I mean,
they are part
if
of.
I'm a DSA member, that part, you're teaching techniques on how to both resist what's happening now that ultimately theoretically open up the playing field for what comes next. But right, it's sort of like a both and type of situation.
That's right. I mean, there's a 3-stage model here, which is before you reverse it and get to a new thing, you've got to stop it. Before you stop it, you have to slow it down. So there's a series of steps that we just have to get through. And so slowing it down is very critical. And so that technique of slowing it down and eventually stopping it, that is a huge piece of the non-cooperation theory and practice. And then the question of where do we go next? How do we advance to be a more democratic? Those are embedded in how people are doing it, the values they're talking about. We're going to debate what kind of policies and what kind of ways, who should get part of that. I mean, those are going to be in the mix in the debate right now as we figure out what kind of society we're trying to aim for.
Really appreciate it, and hope to talk to both of you again, maybe 4, 5, 6 months, get a sense of how it's going. I mean, I think we'll have a sense, but really appreciate the time.
Thanks for your work.
Thanks
we
so
will
much.
put those links within the podcast and the YouTube description. Thanks again, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.